Look at the map between Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Sulawesi, and the open water east of Bali, and the first mistake is to see empty sea. The Lombok and Makassar passages seem like spare lanes around Southeast Asia, but spare lanes become powerful only when they can absorb the pressure placed on them. The Strait of Malacca is the famous name in this region because it is shorter, busier, and closer to the main industrial coastline of Asia. But the ships that worry planners are often the ones that make the shortcut complicated: deep draft tankers, very large crude carriers, and heavy cargoes that need room under the keel. This is why the Lombok route matters. Not because it replaces Malacca, but because it exposes the cost of needing a replacement at all. One ship leaving the Indian Ocean can turn toward Lombok, pass north through the Makassar Strait, and then reach the Western Pacific without squeezing through Malacca. On a clean graphic, that looks simple. In commercial reality, every extra nautical mile becomes fuel, crew time, schedule risk, charter cost, and insurance exposure. The route is deeper and less constrained in some physical ways, but it isn't a magic tunnel through the map. It moves pressure from one geography into another, from Malacca's narrow traffic lanes into Indonesia's archipelagic waters and regional management system. The first channel is distance. One vessel can avoid one congestion point and still lose days by sailing a longer arc around the islands. For energy cargoes, days aren't decorative numbers. They shift inventory timing at refineries, delivery windows for utilities, and the working capital tied up inside a moving ship. The second channel is concentration. When too many vessels abandon the usual path at the same time, the alternate passage begins to behave less like a relief valve and more like a second choke point. Ports, pilots, coast guards, traffic monitoring systems, and emergency response capacity get pulled into the route's real capacity. The third channel is geography inside geography. Indonesia isn't a blank space around the passage. It is a state with islands, fishing grounds, naval priorities, environmental risks, and political reasons to watch what crosses its waters. This gives the route a different strategic character from a deep ocean shortcut. A ship using Lombok and Makassar is still moving through a region where sovereignty, safety, and commercial traffic has to share the same water. This route's value appears most clearly when Malacca is under stress. A grounding, a collision, a security incident, a sudden military alert, or a spike in insurance concern would not need to close Malacca completely to shift behavior. Even partial uncertainty can push shipping firms to examine alternatives before the map formally says blockade. This is how choke points often work. The market reacts to risk before the physical passage stops moving. But the alternate route produces a harder question. When the largest tankers and some energy cargoes can use Lombok, does that make Asia safer, or does it simply move the vulnerability into a wider network? That answer depends on what the viewer thinks a choke point is. If a choke point is only a narrow place, Lombok seems like a solution. If a choke point is a system where many decisions has to move through limited capacity, Lombok gets pulled into the same pressure map. Shipping planners care about depth, but they also care about predictability. One longer voyage with low uncertainty may be acceptable. A longer voyage with rising military, weather, or administrative uncertainty becomes more expensive than its distance suggests. That is why naval presence around this region is more than about dramatic patrols. It is about confidence in lanes, response time after incidents, and the ability to tell commercial operators that the water will remain usable. The ships themselves produce another constraint. A very large tanker can't simply behave like a small coastal vessel. Its turn radius, stopping distance, draft, cargo value, and insurance profile make the waterway feel narrower than it looks from space. If traffic flows through an archipelago, the route is shaped by bathymetry, weather, surveillance, and local activity, not just by the open blue color on the map. This is why a backup route can be physically wider and still strategically tight. That same logic applies to energy security. East Asian economies don't only need oil and LNG to exist somewhere in the market. They need those cargoes to arrive on schedule, in sequence, and at terminals built for specific delivery patterns. A delay across many vessels can become a planning issue long before it becomes a public shortage. Refineries may adjust runs. Utilities may pull from storage, and traders may price the uncertainty into contracts. That public sees a ship route, the system sees timing. For Indonesia, the route brings influence and responsibility at the same time. More attention to Lombok and Makassar grows the strategic importance of Indonesian waters, but it also increases the burden of monitoring, safety, environmental protection, and diplomatic balancing. One major spill or collision in a passage used as a regional fallback would not be a local story for long. That pressure would move quickly into energy markets, shipping schedules, and government conversations about maritime security. That is the quiet reason alternative choke points matter. They aren't only plan B for the ships. They are tests of whether the surrounding system can handle being promoted from background geography to strategic infrastructure. That route also forces a more honest view of redundancy. Redundancy is useful only when the backup has spare capacity, political acceptance, emergency response, and enough commercial trust to absorb shock. A line on a map can show an alternate path. It can't prove that the path can hold the same burden under stress. This distinction is the real story behind Lombok and Makassar. They lower dependence on one route, but they don't remove dependence from maritime geography itself. They show that the Indo-Pacific isn't a single corridor. It is a bundle of corridors with different costs and weaknesses. That stronger the trade connection between the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea becomes, the more valuable those alternate corridors become. But value invites scrutiny. A passage that once seemed secondary can become a place where navies watch each other, insurers shift assumptions, and states discover that geography has become leverage. The likely future isn't a clean replacement of Malacca by Lombok. It is a mixed system, where normal commerce still favors the fastest route, while contingency planning holds the deeper Eastern Passage in the strategic conversation. In a crisis, the difference between normal and contingency can shrink very quickly. This is why the Lombok route deserves attention before a headline forces it into view. The dangerous moment isn't only a closure. It is the period when companies, states, and militaries all begin to adjust at once. In that moment, the alternate route stops being a footnote and becomes a signal of confidence. When vessels shift smoothly, the region looks resilient. If costs jump, schedules break, and response capacity looks thin, the alternate route reveals a second vulnerability. The lesson isn't that Lombok is weak. That lesson is that redundancy is a system, not a synonym for distance. In a normal year, the commercial preference still leans toward the shortest reliable corridor because a shipping firm is paid to deliver cargo, not to prove geopolitical resilience. That preference matters because it produces habit. Terminals expect one timing rhythm. Refineries arrange inventory around that rhythm, and charter contracts reflect the price of that rhythm. When a ship turns toward Lombok, it isn't only choosing water. It is stepping outside the pattern that many downstream systems have already priced into their schedules. That difference may sound small on one voyage, but a corridor shock is never about one voyage after the first week. It becomes about fleets, berth availability, storage tanks, crew rotations, bunkering stops, weather windows, and the difficult question of which cargo receives priority. The Lombok route is also less famous in public debate, and that lack of fame can be misleading. One route can be secondary in peacetime publicity while still being central in a crisis planning folder. Maritime planners often care most about places that are quiet until the primary route becomes unstable. Those places reveal how much genuine redundancy the system has, rather than how much redundancy the map appears to offer. The depth of the Lombok route gives it a technical advantage for the largest ships, but depth alone doesn't produce automatic resilience. One deep passage still needs navigation confidence, emergency response, clear rules, and enough regional trust to remain attractive during stress. When the route becomes crowded suddenly, traffic separation and monitoring become more important than they looked in normal times. This is why a passage can be safer for a few large vessels than for a sudden surge of diverted traffic. Capacity isn't a static number. It depends on the mix of ships, the speed of decisions, and the quality of coordination around the lane. One tanker captain sees the route differently from a strategist in a capital city. The captain thinks about currents, visibility, draft, traffic, communications, and the consequences of a mistake with millions of barrels behind the hull. The strategist thinks about energy flows, naval posture, diplomatic reassurance, and whether a partner can hold commerce moving without becoming a target of pressure. That same passage therefore holds two kinds of calculation at once: the technical calculation of safe transit and the political calculation of strategic dependence. Indonesia's role is central because the alternate route passes through waters where Jakarta's preferences can't be treated as background scenery. A state that controls the surrounding maritime space gains visibility, responsibility, and bargaining weight when the route becomes more important. That doesn't mean Indonesia can or would weaponize every passage decision. It means commercial dependence produces diplomatic attention, and diplomatic attention gives the surrounding state more strategic significance. A powerful country looking for redundancy has to therefore deal with the politics of the backup route, not only the physics of the backup route. That makes Lombok different from a pure engineering alternative. It isn't a bypass cut through empty land. It is a passage embedded inside a major archipelagic state with its own security concerns and maritime agenda. The route also shifts how navies think about presence. A navy protecting commerce in Malacca may require one pattern of patrols, sensors, and relationships. One navy planning for Lombok and Makassar needs another pattern, spread across a wider and more complex maritime environment. That wider route can require more awareness, not less, because the relevant geography extends through several connected waters. This is why the strategic cost of a backup can be hidden until the backup is actually needed. That commercial cost is easier to see: more distance, more fuel, more time. The security cost is more subtle: more places to monitor, more stakeholders to coordinate, and more uncertainty about how behavior shifts under pressure. For energy importers in Northeast Asia, the route has to be evaluated against storage strategy as well. When a country holds enough reserves and has flexible contracts, a delayed voyage may be manageable. When inventories are thin or demand is high, the same delay can become a policy problem. That is why chokepoint risk can't be separated from domestic energy planning. One ship at sea and a storage tank onshore are parts of one system. The route's importance climbs because world trade isn't evenly distributed across the ocean. Energy cargoes, manufactured goods, raw materials, and container services follow corridors shaped by geography, economics, and port networks. If one part of that corridor becomes unreliable, the search for alternatives is constrained by the rest of the network. A ship can't simply choose any blue space and call it a route. It needs ports, fuel, depth, traffic rules, and a destination schedule that still works when it arrives. This is the practical limit of map-based optimism. Lombok and Makassar are valuable because they exist, but their value is conditional because they have to work inside a larger system. One resilient Indo-Pacific trade network would treat them as prepared alternatives rather than emergency improvisations. That means exercises, traffic planning, communication channels, spill response, and diplomatic habits before the emergency. Without that preparation, the route might still be usable, but the first crisis would be more expensive and more uncertain than it required to be. That is the quiet warning inside the backup route. One world that depends on maritime redundancy has to invest in redundancy before the headline arrives. The ship that turns east around Indonesia isn't escaping geography. It remains entering a different version of it. One useful comparison is the difference between a planned diversion and a forced diversion. In a planned diversion, fuel contracts, berth windows, weather expectations, and customer schedules are adjusted before the ship shifts course. In a forced diversion, those adjustments happen while cargo is already moving and while competitors are trying to solve the same issue. This second condition is when the route's hidden limitations become visible. Bunkering capacity may matter more than the public expects because a longer route shifts where vessels need fuel. Port call choices may shift because a ship that loses days may also lose its assigned slot at the destination terminal. Weather in the Indonesian archipelago can affect confidence differently from traffic in Malacca, creating a separate risk calendar rather than a simple replacement. The security picture is also layered because piracy, illegal fishing, gray zone surveillance, and state naval movements don't produce the same kind of risk. One commercial operator has to distinguish between nuisance risk, safety risk, political risk, and full strategic crisis. Different risks produce different route choices. That is why serious planning can't say only that Lombok exists. It has to ask what kind of stress would push which ships toward Lombok, how fast that shift would occur, and how regional authorities would manage it. When only deep-draft energy carriers shift, the system experiences one kind of pressure. If container lines, bulk carriers, military support ships, and tankers all reconsider routes at once, the pressure is broader. That corridor's future will also be shaped by the growth of Asian demand. More consumption means more sensitivity to delays, because more firms and governments depend on the same maritime timing. A route that once absorbed occasional diversion can turn into strategically important as baseline demand climbs. The danger isn't that the route is unusable. That danger is that planners may overstate how much safety the alternate route buys. Lombok provides options, and options are valuable. But options aren't the same as immunity. One mature resilience plan would track the route as a living system. Port readiness, patrol coordination, bathymetric constraints, traffic growth, weather patterns, and regional diplomacy. This kind of preparation is quieter than a naval headline, but it is what makes a backup real. The deeper water gives planners a reason to hold the route in mind. That surrounding complexity gives them a reason not to become complacent. That final operational detail is communication. If shipowners, Indonesian authorities, port operators, and energy buyers don't share a clear picture during disruption, the route can lose confidence even when the water remains usable. A deeper passage can still hold shallow assumptions. One wider sea can still narrow the choices of governments and markets. And a route built to avoid one choke point can become the place where the next strategic test